Wednesday, January 13th, 1999. It's a cold day in Baltimore, the US. An 18-year-old student is finishing her school day at Woodlawn High School. She has things to do, places to go. She needs to pick up her 6-year-old cousin from daycare, and after that, she is scheduled for a shift at LensCrafters. She's responsible and reliable, despite her relatively young age. At around 2:15 in the afternoon, a classmate spots her in the hallway. Nothing seems out of the ordinary. The girl gets into her car and drives out of the parking lot. And then she disappears, and she will never be seen alive again. This is the story of Hae Min Lee. If you and your child spent years growing up on social media and experienced serious mental health struggles, you should hear this. Recently, a jury ordered Meta and YouTube to pay millions for their role in designing and promoting addictive platforms. They knew their apps could contribute to anxiety, depression, and body image issues, but didn't share those risks while prioritizing profits. The recent historic verdict underscores the consequences of those decisions. Now, Morgan & Morgan is stepping up to hold these platforms accountable for the harm they caused. Click the link in my bio to take a short quiz, and you may be entitled to a potential recovery of over $1,000. No one could have predicted what would follow after Hae Min Lee got into her car. News of her case would outlast the trial, outlast the appeals, and upend nearly everyone's certainty about the truth behind what happened. One family would spend decades grieving a daughter. The other would spend decades fighting for a son. And the rest of the world would spend years choosing sides. But before we get into that, we need to learn more about the woman at the center of everything. Hae Min Lee was born on October 15, 1980, in South Korea. Her family immigrated to the United States and settled in Baltimore County, Maryland. By her senior year of high school, she was, by every account, genuinely loved by her peers, who affectionately called her Hae. Hae was active too. She played field hockey and lacrosse. She worked part-time to help her family. She even interned for her school's French teacher, who described her as a kind spirit. She also kept a handwritten diary full of raw, messy, honest parts of being 18. Heartbreak, hope, figuring out who you are. Hae had a younger brother named Young, and a baby cousin she regularly looked after. Her friends at Woodlawn would later say she had a way of making people feel like they mattered. She was also navigating the end of a tumultuous relationship in the months before she disappeared. She had been dating Adnan Syed, a fellow senior. He was popular, charming, the kind of guy the whole school seemed to like. But the relationship had been somewhat secret. Both families were conservative, and a teenage romance between a Korean-American girl and a Pakistani-American boy came with its complications. But then, suddenly, there was no longer any secret to keep. In late December 1998, Hae and Adnan broke up. For Hae, the matter was already behind her. She had started seeing Don Clendonst, a 22-year-old coworker from LensCrafters. She was in deep. In her diary, she wrote Don's name 127 times on a single page, counted each one, then wrote 127 Dons. She changed her AOL profile. Under interests, she put, most importantly, Dawn. Under occupation, she wrote, part-time sales, full-time girlfriend. The night before she disappeared, the last words she wrote in her diary were, I love you, Dawn. On January 13th, 1999, Hae Min Lee had a full afternoon ahead of her. After school, she needed to pick her cousin up from daycare and drop him home. And after that, she had an 8-hour shift at LensCrafters. That morning, a classmate recalled seeing Adnan asking Hae for a ride after school, but she appeared to turn him down. Adnan had lent his car and cell phone to a friend named Jay Wilds for the day. There was nothing unusual about it. It was something he'd done before. Jay kept both, and someone else had given Adnan a ride to school. Around 2:15 p.m., Hae was seen leaving the school premises. A classmate spotted her in the hallway. She was headed to the school parking lot where she got into her car, a 1998 Nissan Sentra, and drove away from Woodlawn. By 3:30, Hae's family knew something was wrong. She hadn't picked up her cousin, and she hadn't gone to work. Both of these incidents were completely out of character. Hae was responsible, especially when it came to her cousin. So they called the police and reported her missing. That evening, the police reached out to Adnan. He told them that the last time he saw Hae was when school ended, and he had no idea where she might be. For 4 weeks, her family didn't know if she was dead or alive. There was no body, no crime scene, no note. There was just the weight of her absence and the torture of not knowing what had happened. And then the news came. On February 9th, 1999, a man stopped his car near a wooded section of Leakin Park and walked into the trees. In the undergrowth, he found something he wasn't looking for. Lying in the ground, partially buried, was the body of Hae Min Lee. She had been left in a shallow grave, face down, concealed by a loose layer of soil and leaves. She was still wearing the clothes she wore to school on January 13th, her gray blazer stained. Now, Leakin Park, to outsiders, might seem like a location chosen at random by someone in a panic. After all, Hae's body was not buried deeply at all. The grave dug for her was barely 6 inches deep in some places. But locals know better. The location was not random at all. Since the 1940s, the park has been used as a dumping site for murder victims, and nearly 80 bodies have been recovered from the woods over the decades. Someone chose that park because its reputation for being the burial ground. The police were called and Hae's body was taken for an autopsy. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was manual strangulation. Someone had used their bare hands to choke Hae Min Lee to death. And there was another thing that the medical examiner noted as unusual. Hae's body had no defensive wounds. A news outlet speculated on what this could mean. Maybe she had no time to fight back before she was incapacitated. Or maybe she had been manually restrained. We don't know the technicalities, but the medical examiner determined Hae had died within hours of her disappearance. That meant that she had been found almost 4 weeks after her death, which was bad news for the investigation. Whatever the burial site might have told investigators about who put her there, footprints, fibers, trace evidence, the elements had already done their work in destroying all of it. By the time police arrived in Leakin Park, the physical trail from that Wednesday afternoon was largely gone. No clear DNA evidence could be recovered from the scene, and nothing was found to identify the perpetrator. But another thing that was notably not at the scene was Hae's car. Her Nissan Sentra was found parked in West Baltimore, not near the park, but 10 miles away, and the keys were left inside. Getting from the car to Leakin Park would have required either a second person or a second vehicle. Hae couldn't possibly have walked there. Someone had chosen to abandon the vehicle in West Baltimore. The fact provided a little information, but it would be 3 days until the case took a decisive turn. On February 12, 1999, the Baltimore City Police received an anonymous phone call. The caller told investigators to look into Adnan Syed. This anonymous tip led to Adnan becoming the prime suspect. Police subpoenaed Adnan's cell phone records, and with that, they began building a timeline. They contacted one of Adnan's friends, a young woman named Jen Pusateri. Jen directed the police toward Jay Wilds. He was Adnan's closest friend, the one who'd borrowed Adnan's car and phone. Jen's story went like this. Jay had called her on the day of the murder and asked her to pick him up at a Best Buy. He told her that Adnan had strangled Hae because Hae had broken his heart. And Hae's death wasn't just something Jay had heard about. He had helped Adnan bury her body. After that is when Jen got involved. She drove Jay to the Westview Mall to wipe his fingerprints off the shovels, then to Superfresh, where Jay dumped the clothes he'd worn that night. On February 28, 1999, the police brought Jay in. Adnan Syed was arrested the same day and charged with first-degree murder. He was 17 at the time, but he would be tried as an adult. The case against him rested almost exclusively on second-hand accounts of what had happened. The physical evidence was incredibly limited. Regarding the motive, Adnan told the police that he had no hard feelings towards Hae after the breakup. But witnesses and Hae's own diary entries painted a very different picture. According to them, Adnan had reached out to Hae's new boyfriend. He'd follow Hae around and would appear at places she was at. While Adnan insisted there was no issue there, these observations described someone who hadn't fully let go. And on the morning of January 13th itself, he asked her for a ride, the last known conversation between them. What happened in the hours between the school bell and the midnight that night is what everything comes down to. The state's version of events was this. At around 2:15 in the afternoon, within a 20-minute window, Adnan killed Hae and stuffed her body into the trunk of her Nissan Sentra. Then he called Jay, who went to meet him. Adnan then opened the trunk of Hae's car and showed Jay the body. As we know, Jay had Adnan's car, so there were two vehicles available, Adnan's car and Hae's. They stashed Hae's car at a commuter lot, then Jay dropped Adnan at track practice, so no one would notice anything unusual, and he'd have an alibi. Afterward, the two met again at a McDonald's, during which the police called Adnan's cell phone asking if he'd seen Hae. He said no. Then, once it got dark, the pair brought both cars to Leakin Park to bury Hae's body. After the burial, they abandoned Hae's car behind a row of apartment buildings in West Baltimore. Police later found a map in the backseat. The page for Leakin Park had been ripped out, and Adnan's partial palm print was on the back cover. The prosecution's case rested heavily on that theory, that Adnan's palm print placed him in her car on the day of her disappearance. The story seems perfectly plausible. After all, there was a motive, there were witnesses, there was a partial palm print. But it turned out the case wasn't so simple. Take, for example, Jay Wilds. By the time Jay first spoke to the police on February 28, 1999, he had not been arrested. He walked into the police station voluntarily. The prosecutors offered him a plea deal. Plead guilty to being an accessory after the fact, testify against Adnan, and serve no time in prison. Jay took the deal. In a 2014 interview with The Intercept, the first time Jay had ever spoken publicly about the case, he explained why he said he went along with burying the body. He claimed Adnan had threatened to report him to the police for dealing drugs to high school students. So his own explanation for being at that grave was that he had been coerced by the very man he was persuaded to testify against. It was in his own best interest to point the finger at Adnan. It could be completely true, but under scrutiny, Jay's story started to fall apart. Across 3 separate pre-trial interviews, Jay's account changed multiple times. In his first recorded interview, he said Adnan had popped the trunk open at an entirely different location, not at a Best Buy. The location then changed between successive interviews as Jay struggled to keep his story straight. By the time Jay testified at a trial in 2000, the story the jury heard was Adnan told Jay that morning he was going to kill Hae. That afternoon, Jay met Adnan at a Best Buy, where Adnan opened the trunk of Hae's car to show him her dead body. They buried her in Leakin Park that night and abandoned her car in West Baltimore. Of course, the prosecution couldn't rely on Jay's account alone. They paired his testimony with cell phone tower data from Adnan's Nokia, pings that placed Adnan in Leakin Park during that time. Though there was a problem with this evidence too. Adnan's cell phone data was admissible at the time, but his cell phone carrier, AT&T, had a legal disclaimer that stated that incoming call data could not be used to reliably determine the location of a phone. The prosecution had leaned heavily on the incoming call data, and the defense did very little to challenge the claim. That disclaimer sat in the evidence file for the entirety of the trial, and nobody took it into account. And then there's Asia McClain. Asia was a classmate of Adnan's, and after he was arrested, she reached out to his family and said she saw him at the Woodlawn High Library at around 2:30 p.m. on the day of Hae's disappearance, right in the middle of the window of time in which the prosecution had determined that the murder had occurred. Asia remembered it specifically because they talked about his breakup with Hae. She wrote to Adnan when he was in prison saying she was willing to testify. However, for some reason, Adnan's defense attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, never called Asia McClain to the stand. And that's not the only issue Adnan had with his attorney. His original trial in December 1999 ended in a mistrial after jurors overheard part of an argument between the judge and his lawyer, who interpreted the judge's words as an accusation that she was lying. A court would later rule that she'd provided Adnan with ineffective assistance, failing him as a client. Not only that, Gutierrez was disbarred the following year amid complaints that she'd taken money from another client but had failed to protect his rights. She died in 2004. She never explained her decision not to call Asia McClain as a witness. In February 2000, the jury convicted Adnan Syed on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and robbery. He was handed a sentence of life in prison plus 30 years. He was 18 years old by the time he was convicted. For years, Adnan continued fighting the conviction through appeals and post-conviction filings, arguing that critical evidence had been mishandled and that his legal representation had failed him. He consistently maintained his innocence. Then, in October 2014, a journalist named Sarah Koenig released the first episode of Serial. Serial was a podcast giving a week-by-week investigation into Adnan's conviction. Koenig was careful. She didn't declare him innocent or guilty. She just did what a good journalist does. She pulled the case apart, thread by thread, the timeline, Jay's shifting story, the cell tower disclaimer, Asia McClain's missing witness testimony. She asked, out loud, does any of this actually hold up? The audience, which numbered millions, was divided. Debates raged online, and the podcast launched a global fixation unlike anything true crime had ever seen. In its first month, Serial reached 5 million downloads, faster than any podcast in history. And it won a Peabody Award, the first ever awarded to a podcast. To date, the show has racked up over 300 million downloads. But here is something worth noting. Serial was never about finding Hae's killer. It was about examining Adnan's conviction. In 2015 and 2016, Asia McClain finally testified in post-conviction hearings, saying exactly what she had maintained from the start. An expert analysis of the AT&T records confirmed that the disclaimer was right. Incoming cell phone data could not, in fact, determine the exact location of a phone. Then in 2022, something changed. Baltimore City prosecutors re-examined the case and moved to vacate Adnan's conviction. Their motion pointed to 2 alternate suspects, men the state didn't name at the time. According to that motion, one had allegedly threatened Hae's life before she disappeared. The other had a connection to the area where her car was found. And prosecutors argued none of it had been turned over to Adnan's defense, a failure known as a Brady violation when the state withholds evidence that could help the accused. On September 19th, 2022, a judge vacated Adnan's conviction. After 22 years in prison, Adnan Syed walked out of the courthouse a free man. The Lee family wasn't present for the ruling as they hadn't been given enough notice to attend. And that detail, the fact that the family of the victim had not been informed in time to attend the hearing, cracked the case wide open again. Hae's brother, Young Lee, filed an appeal, stating that his family's rights as victims of a violent crime were violated when they were not properly notified of the hearing. In March 2023, a Maryland appellate court agreed with him and reinstated Adnan's conviction. In December 2024, Adnan's lawyers filed a motion under Maryland's Juvenile Restoration Act, a law that allows people who were minors when they committed their crimes and have served at least 20 years in prison to seek a reduced sentence. Adnan was only 17 when Hae was killed, and he had spent over 2 decades behind bars. Young Lee asked the judge to deny the motion. He described the evidence against Adnan as overwhelming. But DNA testing of items found on Hae's body found no match to Adnan. In a hearing on February 26, 2025, Judge Jennifer Schiffer said that Adnan had been given a second chance, adding, "But everyone needs to remember that Hae Min Lee never had the chance." On March 6, 2025, the judge officially issued her ruling. She reduced Adnan's sentence to time served, with 5 years of supervised probation. He was still guilty of murder in the eyes of the law, but he would not be going back to prison. It was a devastating blow to the Lee family. At the hearing on February 26, Hae's brother, Young Lee, spoke against Adnan, saying through tears that Adnan had deprived him of the joy of becoming an uncle. "I always dreamed of being an uncle to her kids and spoil them. I don't have a chance to see my sister walk down the aisle. He took that away from me." And it is important to remember the judge's words. Hae never had a chance. She was just 18. She had a loving family, friends who adored her, and a future she never had the opportunity to realize. And along with her death came the devastation of her family. Yoonhwa Kim, Hae's mother, said she'd lost the will to live when she lost her daughter. Her life just fell apart. Young Lee mourns the milestones that his sister never had the opportunity to hit. As for Adnan's guilt, it's impossible to draw a clear conclusion. He was found to have ineffective legal counsel, the evidence was shaky, and yet his conviction still stands. If he is guilty, then it is of some consolation that he served over 20 years in prison. If not, then the case tore apart 2 families, and justice has yet to be served. So what do you think about this case? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and that is all for today. Thanks for watching.